Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to this LinkedIn Live with me, Justin York, where today we're going to talk about why it is that organizations get stuck in that data swamp. You know, from the image that I put out, we've got four eras that I like to talk about. We've got about the prehistoric, the swamp, and we've got the cavemen, a bit of discovery, a bit of enlightenment. Then we have sort of a foundation area where we understand that tall buildings need strong foundations. And then on the right-hand side, we have all that high-speed, AI-enabled, fantastic world that everybody would like to be in. But you can't just parachute into the AI-enabled world because many are still dealing with recurring data issues, spreadsheets, unclear ownership, manual fixes. So what makes them stuck? Why do they get stuck in that environment? And we have to understand that wherever we are, whichever data era we're in, it's not a technical maturity problem. So if we're in the swamp, it isn't a technical maturity problem. And in the same way, if we're in the AI-enabled, enlightened part of the world, that's not necessarily 100% driven by technology. So what does stuck being look like? You know, we talk about these things quite a lot. And we hear things like repeated data issues. See this all the time. I hear this all the time. Repeated data issues. Something is turning up all the time. Somebody is fixing things continually. It gets reported, nothing gets done. So this issue keeps turning over, keeps coming back over and over and over and over again. We have this thing around definitions. People not using the right definitions. And I use bi-weekly. I really must think of another one. But I use bi-weekly because it's twice a week or once every 2 weeks. So it can mean two separate things. And depending on who's using it and what the context is of it being used, it depends on what it means. So one part of the organization can say every 2 weeks, and one part of the organization can say twice a week. And unless you understand that, then it makes things a little bit confusing and thereby definition frustrating for people. We may have something like manual reporting. And so what we've got here is people creating reports with spreadsheets and all those types of things. Nothing against spreadsheets, use them all the time. But if you're going to use them for reporting, organizational reporting, or feeding into regulatory reports, then you have to make sure that the controls and checks and balances and everything are all there for those reports and on those spreadsheets. We might talk about this a lot as well, about passive ownership. We might have a name in the frame. We might have somebody on the organization chart or in the RACI matrix. So we've got that name, but it's still unclear who is accountable. That person might have left and nothing's been updated. That person may be passive because they don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing. They're not making decisions. They're not allocating resource to get things fixed. We all see the workarounds and shortcuts. These things are there because there's a gap in the process. Something isn't working well. Operational reality is not reflected in the approved official process. And that means that people will take whatever path of least resistance they can in order to get the job done. And that means creating workaround shortcuts, that type of things. And then we have these heroes and heroines, these single points of failure, these people that have all this stuff locked up inside their heads. They've got tons and tons of knowledge about the organization. They've got lots of things that they know. They might know the origin of a workaround, for example. But if they were to leave tomorrow, what is it that won't work in your organization? Because the origin of the workaround is lost. Another piece of knowledge that belonged just in those people that they would gladly share with you, but they never write down. All that stuff gets lost. So you have to ask yourselves, do you have modern technology sitting on top of old data behaviors? The chances are you have somewhere. Something will be happening like that. So what we need to do is try and find out what those things are. There are 6 typical reasons that I see why organizations get stuck. We have lots of growth going on. People are moving forwards at high speed, new initiatives, do this, do that. all these things are happening, but there's little visibility of what's happening in the background, how that's occurring, how are we actually getting to those perspectives and points of view? How is that actually working? We may have fragmented ownership. When I talk about fragmented ownership, we might have two owners who are thinking to themselves, actually, I own those sets of data. So they come up with different rules and different definitions. And there's no agreement about how these things should be used or who owns what. And because we have fragmented ownership, we tend to end up with lots of frustration, lots of different meetings and discussions and those types of things, which pretty much kick the can down the road because we don't get the distinct decision-making that we need. People might have, or organizations might have, all the paperwork. They've got the policies, they've got the operating model, they've got a framework, looks very nice. They've got the roles and responsibilities. They've set up a forum or a committee to discuss all these items. They've got all the standards and data quality rules. All that stuff is there, but it exists on paper. So you have data governance on paper, and that is not the same as implementing or embedding data governance. So anything that is on paper is doing you no good at all unless it's being used. Because metaphorically, it's gathering dust in one of your systems or servers. And if it's old enough, it may be gathering dust on one of your shelves or in a filing cabinet somewhere. We will see that workarounds or shortcuts have been normalized. People just accept them as being there. It's the way the job is done. Oh, we don't follow that process. We do this instead because this is quicker. Yes, it's quicker for them, but it might be creating more work for somebody else further down the organization. And if we are pulling in the same direction, then we should be thinking about the impact of our actions. And that comes down to data literacy and our understanding of the data and the overall processes that we are using. We may well find that we're under pressure in all sorts of ways, delivery pressures. We've got people asking if reports are ready constantly. We've got adult requests coming in all of the time. I want this and I want it now. People jumping up and down, all that kind of stuff. So we end up with delivery pressure. When people are under pressure, they will make whatever decision's good for them to get the job done. Because all these things could be ad hoc type things that they're not really in their full job description. They don't really have time for, so they'll take the shortcuts. And then when we've got all these workarounds and we've got all these shortcuts and things like that going on, then we're also building up a load of hidden dependencies because we don't know, it's not visible to us what is any longer dependent on what, because we're outside of the approved processes. And that's part of the reason we have processes, so that we can step back through those things and we can see how the data is used, how it's moving, what happens to it on its journey. But if we don't have that, then we have all these hidden dependencies. And each one of those things starts to build up a little bit of risk in the background. So most organizations are not getting stuck because there's no work going on. It's not because there is nothing happening in the organization. There's lots of stuff happening, but they get stuck because that stuff is happening informally. It's not being clearly managed. It's not visible, and therefore you cannot take any action to look at those gaps or where there are inefficiencies. Now, one of those things that we talk about there, they are all about behaviors. None of that is technology. Technology might enable those things to happen, but the actual behaviors, the people, those things are coming out from them. They're making those decisions, rightly or wrongly. Those are the decisions that they make. So we have to think then about how do people fill these gaps that are occurring. So we'll see lots of things like manual corrections. And manual corrections inside a spreadsheet, all right, fair enough. If it's just your little local spreadsheet, that's your budget for your groceries every month or something like that, fine, make a manual correction, doesn't really matter. But if we've got data, if that spreadsheet is normally fed from something else, or we're getting the data from a source system, making a manual correction means that we've moved away from the source that we had. And unless we can prove the quality of it, then there's a risk created by undertaking that manual correction. Those spreadsheets that are there, people will create spreadsheets. They'll have copies of spreadsheets. People will create new tabs. People will copy stuff into new tabs. People will cut and paste data from one spreadsheet into another. But if we update those, if we don't have the controls in place on those spreadsheets, when those things get updated, if that value goes into the wrong field and it's accepted by that field, it doesn't particularly throw any error or problem, then the values in that spreadsheet are now changed. And if you don't notice it and you're using it for reporting, particularly if it's regulatory reporting, that means that that data moves forward and it's just not correct. And so unless somebody picks it up, it will just go forward as not correct. The thing is, the next month when you do it, or the next week or whenever, that data is still incorrect. So unless we catch it and fix it, then it could just get worse. Talked about those heroes and heroines, those people that keep all the stuff inside their heads. That is a lot about personal knowledge. It's about their understanding of what's going on. And it could well be why a workaround exists, why a shortcut exists. Why do we do a particular thing? How much time does it save us? But typically they're not going to know what the impact is on anybody else, because workarounds are generally, or shortcuts are generally there because they are there in a very localized place. So it's not very much about what's happening 2 different organizations down or through the warehouse or what goes into the report. It's about saving themselves time. Now, I've seen a lot of this. I've seen this when I was working at an aircraft engineering organization. And this is the old thing where somebody said, well, if you just select other, so this is personal knowledge, somebody's selecting other from the list of engineering faults on an aircraft, and you type XXX in the text box, it allows you to move on. If you're really up against it quite a lot in terms of time, it's late at night or whatever it is, you're going to select other and XXX. Now that personal knowledge that somebody worked out became a workaround. But it's not saving anybody any time, because another engineer has to look at that and then say, well, what's that? So then they have to go back and look at all the documentation and all the paperwork associated with the aircraft and figure it out. So all this personal knowledge that's in people's heads, it's not written down. The chances of you uncovering that are pretty slim, really, unless you ask them on the right day the right question. And then we have this kind of unofficial process. And again, that comes back to sort of that engineering example, because that process isn't the official way. The system allows it to happen, but that is not the official way that engineering task should be done. The official way is to scroll down the list, select the correct error or issue, and then fill in the text that says, what does that actually mean? Describe it. That's the correct process. So the unofficial process is other XXX. Now, lots of people do that. The word got around and loads of people did it. And of course, the way that we get around that is we just move other into the place where it's supposed to be in the list. So you have to scroll to find it, which means that you probably have to come across the one you wanted anyway. So unofficial processes, personal knowledge, spreadsheets, and manual corrections. These things can create quite a lot of problems in your organization. But it's those people that are doing those things, those workarounds, shortcuts, using their personal knowledge, that keep the ecosystem alive. They're keeping it afloat. It's like the swan scenario. Everything is smooth and serene on the surface, but underneath it's paddling like mad against the current. That's what we're thinking about here. But every time they keep the ecosystem alive by taking the path of least resistance, they may also be hiding where the ecosystem has weakness, and it's weakness that we need to find and resolve. So you might be asking, or somebody might ask you, well, hold on a minute, we've got data governance. So why hasn't governance fixed this? Well, there is a difference, as I alluded to earlier, between implementing governance and embedding it. Because implementing it, you could stand up in a meeting and say, we've implemented data governance, we've got a policy, an operating model, a framework, we've got roles and responsibilities and a committee and all that interesting stuff. Yeah, that's fine. But you don't have data governance. You have it on paper, and that's true. But it's not in the day-to-day business. It's not in people's psyche that this is what they have to do. And so governance, you think, could exist. But if the owners are not deciding, they're not making decisions, they're not allocating resources, they're not removing blockers, they're not supporting their data stewards, then you don't have data governance, right? They're not being active, they're being passive. So when they're being passive, what you then have are the data stewards in the data stewardship trap, which is that they've got all the responsibility to get stuff done, but they have no authority. Nothing is delegated to them. They don't really have any power over what it is that they are doing. Sure, in their little part of the business, they do have that level of authority. But once you step outside of that, then they don't really have any authority. We will see, for example, that the recurring issues keep coming back. They're just continuing. Even though that we have reported that issue, if you don't get some kind of feedback that says, yeah, got the issue, it's going to be fixed in 6 months in software release 76, then you don't know when it's going to be fixed. You don't know if anybody's actually doing anything at all with that issue. So the recurring issues continue, the manual fixes continue. And then what we have is we have teams bypassing the process. So you might be individuals, and then when the word gets out, like in that engineering example, then whole teams begin to do the same thing. So we've now got lots of people circumventing the official process. They're creating this unofficial process that isn't written down, this workaround. It's not documented anywhere. There's no reason for it. And just to go back to the recurring issues thing, if you are told through feedback that something is going to be fixed in software release 76 in 6 months' time, what you might also find is that the approved workaround until the fix is done is this. Because then when you get that, you then know what you're supposed to be doing. So if you're having those things where you've still got recurring issues, passive owners, data stewards trapped in the stewardship trap, and this bypassing of processes, then data governance hasn't landed. You might have implemented it at a sort of leadership level, but you haven't embedded it. And because you haven't embedded it, it won't be doing anything for you. Now, thinking about my data eras diagram, if we go across to the right-hand side of that and we think about the AI-enabled world and the high-speed environment everybody wants to live in, well, what happens if we introduce AI into an ecosystem that we just don't understand? And when we do that, we could be thinking about unclear lineage. So how does the data get to the model? Where does it come from? You know, I talk about these 6 things, right? What have we got? Where is it? How does it move around? Who's using it? What for? Who owns it? And what's the quality of it? But when we think about lineage, we have to think about where does the data come from? And then we have to consider what happens to it on its journey. What are the changes, the transformations? What controls and rules are applied to that data? Because all of that stuff gives you a level of background and a little bit of trust and confidence in what it is that you're going to put into the model. We may be using inconsistent definitions, the old bi-weekly thing. And if we're using inconsistent definitions of data, then the model could be using it a different way to that it should be doing, or what is meant by that definition. If we go back to the lineage, I talk about what have we got, where is it, how does it move around? Well, the final thing we talk about is quality, but all of these things kind of come together because we have to think about if the quality of the data that's going into that model isn't to a required standard, then should we be using it? And if we do use it, then what's the caveat? What do we have to say about the result that comes from the model? We have to say something along the lines of the quality of the data wasn't to the required standard, therefore we must take whatever result we get with a pinch of salt or whatever you choose to use. There may be hidden manual interventions that we need to know about, because if we've got these hidden dependencies where somebody is coming in and changing a number or whatever they're doing, that is creating a bit of risk for the model, because when we put in stuff into AI, we need to understand what the quality of that stuff is. And if we've got lots of different manual interventions, then what came out of the source system may not be the same or the same standard as what is going into the model. In the same way, we've got to think about accountability. So we need to know who is accountable for the data, who are the data owners, who are the data stewards. But we also have to know who is accountable for the model, who is accountable for the outputs, who is accountable for making sure that the stuff that's going in there is the right standard. Because if we don't have that, then what we tend to do is we think AI is going to help us move along at high speed, when in reality, it's not even going to remove the swamp from us in our data era. What it's going to do is help you move through it a bit faster. Yes, it will highlight lots of things that you didn't know about, or maybe it won't. Depends on what goes in and how it's structured. So it helps you to move faster through the swamp, but it will not remove you from it. So that's all well and good, but how to start getting out of the swamp? How do we get out of there if we find ourselves in there? So we have to start with, what is the critical data that we have in our organization, and what is it specifically that's going to be used in either regulatory reporting, that kind of stuff, or in our AI models? Because the more we understand about the critical data, the more time we can spend on it, and we can spend less time on the non-critical data. Because if you're spending more time on the non-critical data stuff, fine, you're getting stuff fixed, but it doesn't change anything. It's not moving the needle at all. And then we need to follow it end to end. We need to follow it through what happens as it moves through the systems. And then we also have to follow it about what happens in the process as it goes through. Because it's those things where we start to find the gaps. And we're not saying to somebody, oh, just describe to me what they do, because they'll just recite to you whatever their official process is. It's about going to sit and watch them, talk to them. What do you do with this? Oh, I do this. Well, why don't you do that? Because that's the official process. Oh, yeah, I don't do that because this is the workaround we use because it's faster, gets the job done. That helps us to find where people are intervening. And it's important for us to know where people are intervening, because it's those interventions that mean that we've got this operational reality versus official process gap. And it's that gap that what we want to do is we want to change, or we want to close that. We want to identify it, understand it, change something to close that gap or that workaround. We need to clarify the ownership. Who is accountable for what? And it's not just about having a name in the frame. It's not about having a name on your organization chart or in your RACI matrix, but they need to be taking action, making decisions. That's what they need to be doing. And they need to understand why it matters that they do that. As we go through this end-to-end review, we'll start to identify recurring failure points. These recurring failure points is where your recurring data issues keep coming from. And once we've identified them, we can note them, and then we can do something about them. We can find the accountable person, we can highlight the problem, and we can get stuff fixed. Now that enables us, because we think about critical data end to end, we find the gaps and all that kind of thing, it enables us to prioritize where we put our effort. Where is the bang for buck going? What is going to move the needle the most? And we prioritize the root causes of those things first. And if there is something critical like regulatory reporting that we need to address, then we address that first. And then by doing these things and educating people and training them and understanding data literacy, we start to embed governance into the delivery environment, into people's psyche, that this is what we need to do. Will we ever get rid of the workarounds? Unlikely. Will we ever get rid of shortcuts? Probably not. But we can reduce them. And we can get people to understand why it's important that they don't do them, which is more a kind of thing that we should be doing, getting people educated. So all of these things is why your data ecosystem is the thing that decides whether or not your data initiative succeeds or fails. And what I keep seeing is that teams don't fail because they pick the wrong tool. They fail because nobody has mapped the ecosystem in advance of using that tool, which means that we've got stuff moving around in the background that we don't really know about. And so it probably doesn't even get into the tool. But by the time you've mapped it, by the time you've realized that, you're a year, 18 months down the road, and you're not delivering any benefit. And people want return on investment. So that's what the data ecosystem diagnostic is there to help prevent. It's a 90-minute session with me and you. We map the ecosystem end to end, find where it's breaking. We look at which gaps matter the most to you, and then we work out how we can get those things closed, or rather you can get those things closed. And you'll have a written summary about your ecosystem, the gaps, and how you might go about fixing them. So if you are planning an AI or a data initiative in the next 12 months, and you're not certain if the foundations of your ecosystem will hold up, then DM me and I'll let you know if it's a fit. So in this live, we've covered quite a lot of stuff about why do people, organizations stay stuck in the swamp. And it's a common thing that people do that. But you don't leave the swamp by buying more technology, by buying another tool, by adding something to the stack. You leave it because you start to understand it more. You start to understand the behaviors that are driving it. You make the ownership real. You get the governance to land. And you understand how the work is actually done, the operational reality. So when you go back to your desk today, think about if you're thinking you might be in the swamp, then what is the biggest thing that is keeping your organization there? You're going, hi. Problem of data governance rules merely existing in the file in an organization usually happens when central governance teams draft policies in isolation. Yep, very true. Those rules usually clash real-world business operations. Very true. Co-design standards with the domain leaders, embed yourself in their data. Yep, could agree more. You have to understand how these things are working, and you have to think about designing things so that people are involved. You need people engaged. Whenever you think about data governance, get people engaged. That's the way to do it. Next week, I'm going to be talking about how do we move forwards through the rest of the data eras and what can we do to help us along that path. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you there next week.